June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. Picture this: a young soldier's hand trembling as he scribbles in a hidden diary, words that could have landed him in solitary if caught. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could have such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. That shock began right here. As Unterfeldwebel Vera Burkhardt peered out a train window, witnessing electric lights blazing from every farmhouse, every shop, an endless glow stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. Back in Germany, blackout rules had cloaked the Reich in total darkness since 1940. Even before the war, just 20% of German farms had electricity. Yet this so-called decadent America shimmered with power from horizon to horizon, igniting a transformation that would quietly unravel everything these soldiers had been taught to believe. Welcome to World War II Chronicles, where we uncover the stories history nearly forgot. Today, how 1,850 veterans of Rommel's legendary Afrika Corps stepped off cushioned Pullman coaches, not cattle cars, into a stunned Texas crowd. Completely unaware, they were about to witness a different kind of victory, one written not in battles, but in the raw, overwhelming might of American industry. It all started with a surrender. May 13th, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement after the Desert Fox was quietly recalled to Germany, raised the white flag. With him, approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops laid down their weapons. The numbers kept shifting as stragglers trickled in over the following days. These were no ordinary soldiers. These were the desert fighters who had pushed the British all the way back to Egypt, men who had earned even Montgomery's grudging respect. And now, they were prisoners of war. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Rodka, Iron Cross First Class holder, twice wounded in the sands of North Africa. He kept a diary, one later discovered in the U.S. National Archives, and its pages reveal the mind-bending psychological shift that American captivity triggered in hardened Wehrmacht veterans. Their journey into captivity began at Oran, Algeria, where roughly 30,000 prisoners waited in makeshift camps under the hot North African sun. But even here, something felt different. American efficiency stunned them. Thousands were processed daily, precise identity cards issued, medical examinations conducted, and Geneva Convention rights explained to each man in fluent German. Obergefreiter Hans Muir, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote home describing how methodical, how almost respectful the entire process felt. For soldiers raised on propaganda portraying Americans as soft, undisciplined, and culturally inferior, this quiet professionalism was the first crack in the wall. After 8 months in Oran's holding camps waiting for transport ships, the real journey began. Nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The prisoners were loaded onto Pullman coaches, the same cushioned passenger cars that carried American civilians, not boxcars, not prison transports, comfortable seats, with windows they could see through. And what they saw through those windows broke something inside them. As the trains rolled across the American heartland, these soldiers, men who had fought across the Sahara, who had survived British artillery and American Shermans, pressed their faces against the glass like children. Every farmhouse glowed with electric light. Every small town blazed. Factories hummed through the night shift. Car-filled parking lots stretched beside 3-shift industrial plants. Cornfields rolled on endlessly, golden and impossibly vast. They traveled unblindfolded. The Americans didn't bother hiding anything. And that was perhaps the most devastating weapon of all, the sheer casual confidence of a nation that had nothing to hide. When those 1,850 Afrika Corps veterans finally stepped off the train at Mexia, Texas, the local crowd stared. These were Rommel's men, sun-darkened, lean, still carrying the bearing of elite troops. But the prisoners were staring too, at the town, at the cars, at the abundance surrounding them on every side. The camp itself was a further shock. Clean barracks, running water, adequate food, medical facilities, recreation areas, It wasn't luxury, but compared to what they'd endured in the desert, and compared to what they knew prisoners received back in Germany, it was almost incomprehensible. As 1943 wore on, labor shortages across America created an unexpected opportunity. By September, prisoners were being sent to work on farms and in factories, and this is where the real psychological demolition began. They weren't blindfolded during transport. They rode through open country, seeing everything. And everything they saw contradicted every piece of propaganda they'd ever absorbed. At a Houston cotton gin, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine accomplish in 1 hour what his entire village back in Germany produced in a month. One machine, 1 hour, powered by the Colorado River Authority, which had electrified 90% of the farms in its region by 1943. In Nebraska, prisoners watched mechanical combines harvest 100 acres in a single day. Local farmers casually mentioned yields of 60 bushels per acre, double Germany's 30. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, barely able to process what he was seeing, wrote, "A 16-year-old boy drove a tractor worth more than my father earned in his entire life." Near Detroit, prisoners assigned to unload coal at a rail depot caught a glimpse of Ford's River Rouge plant, 100,000 workers under one industrial complex, producing jeeps, tanks, and aircraft engines around the clock, consuming 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more power than the entire city of Hamburg. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner had worked in a food processing plant before the war. He thought he understood industrial production. Then, he visited a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey. There he watched elderly women and teenage girls, not soldiers, not skilled laborers, outproduce what 50-man German teams could manage, all thanks to fully automated production lines. Wagner stood in silence for a long time after that, but the moment that truly shattered their worldview came during the summer 1944 harvest season. Prisoners working the Kansas wheat fields watched in disbelief as American farmers produced so much grain that surplus crops were deliberately plowed back under the soil, not because of waste, but to stabilize market prices. They were destroying food, on purpose, because they had too much. For men whose families back in Germany were surviving on ration cards, whose nation was slowly starving under Allied blockades, this was beyond comprehension. Unterfeldwebel Franz Weber captured it perfectly in his diary. One American farmer, with his machinery, beats 100 German farmers. They could lose half their production and still outproduce all of Europe. The math was devastating, and every prisoner who could count understood exactly what it meant for Germany's chances. Then came June 6, 1944. News of the Normandy invasion swept through every prison camp in America. The numbers alone were staggering. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave alone. Camp newsreels showed artificial harbors, entire ports built from scratch and towed across the English Channel, unloading 15,000 tons of supplies every single day. The prisoners had watched American industry from the inside. They'd seen the farms, the factories, the impossible abundance. Now they were seeing where all of it went. Friedrich Rodka, the Iron Cross holder, made his final diary entry on the war's outcome. "We knew then that all was lost. The war, and every Nazi dream behind it. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power, armed with nothing but fairy tales. Yet what changed these men most deeply wasn't the machinery or the abundance. It was how they were treated as human beings. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his young son had been killed during the Allied bombing of Hamburg, the American camp commander personally delivered the news and offered his condolences. Local church groups, learning of the death, organized to send food packages to Müller's struggling wife back in Germany. Think about that. American civilians whose own sons were fighting and dying against Germany voluntarily helped a German soldier's family. Feldwebel Otto Brandt reflected on this years later. They fought Hitler. They did not fight Germans. And in doing so, they were already preparing us to rebuild. Medical care in the camps went beyond basic treatment. Prisoners suffering psychological breakdowns received genuine therapy. Camp Dr. Bauer, who had initially dismissed American medicine, later admitted, "This humanity was not weakness. It revealed a kind of strength we had never understood." By March 1945, the U.S. government launched a quiet but ambitious program. 25,000 prisoners voluntarily enrolled in democracy education courses. Camp newspapers sprang up, 135 of them across the country, where prisoners debated free markets, constitutional rights, and civil liberties. Officers who had once commanded panzer divisions now spent their evenings planning post-war democratic reforms for a Germany that didn't yet exist. Oberleutnant Herman Guring, no relation whatsoever to the Reichsmarschall, summed it up decades later in a 1975 interview. "We became democracy's missionaries, not through lectures, but through observation. We saw it working with our own eyes every single day." Then in April 1945, the final blow fell. Allied forces liberating concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, filmed what they found. That footage was shown to every prisoner of war camp in America. The screenings were met with silence, absolute crushing silence. Feldwebel Walter Schmidt, who had served the Reich with genuine conviction, wrote afterward, "We thought we were bringing civilization to the world. We were the barbarians. America didn't just defeat us, it showed us what civilization actually means." For men who had spent months witnessing American abundance, American efficiency, and American decency, this final revelation completed the transformation. The ideology they had fought for wasn't just defeated, it was exposed as monstrous. Between 1,945 and 1,946, a total of 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American soil. They didn't go home empty-handed. They carried skills learned in American factories and farms. They carried memories of democratic systems that actually functioned. And most importantly, they carried hope. These men became the quiet architects of West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed a bombed-out nation into Europe's strongest economy within a single generation. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, went on to become West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Holstein, held at Camp Concordia, became the first president of the European Commission, helping build the very European unity that the war had nearly destroyed forever. In 1985, something remarkable happened in Austin, Texas. 500 former German prisoners of war returned to America, voluntarily, not as enemies, not as captives, as guests. Dr. Hans Wehr, who had been held at Fort Robinson, stood before the gathered crowd and said, "The camps gave us running water, heat, food, and something we never expected: dignity." Kurt Meyer, his voice shaking with age and emotion, added, "American farmers invited us to their tables. They shared meals with the enemy that changed us forever." Then 78-year-old Helmut Gutz rose to speak. The room fell quiet. "We came to America as Nazis. We left as Democrats. We saw strength not in weapons but in production, not in racial purity but in diversity, not in obedience but in freedom. We built a new Germany from your example." The standing ovation that followed, united men who had once pointed guns at each other, former enemies now bound by a shared understanding of what truly wins wars. The scale of this program was extraordinary and is largely forgotten today. 500 camps spread across 45 states. Only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont had none. 75 main installations and 325 branch camps, each constructed in roughly 90 days, housing anywhere from 250 to 12,000 prisoners. At its peak, the program held 425,871 Axis prisoners on American soil. 20,000 arrived monthly through 1,943. 30,000 per month after D-Day. 60,000 flooded in as the war ended. Their labor contribution was staggering: 14 million man-days of work, 100 million board feet of lumber harvested, generating $230 million in value at the 1940s rate of 80 cents per day. Security, Out of all those hundreds of thousands of prisoners, only 2,222 escape attempts were ever recorded. The failure rate was 99.4%. Not a single American civilian was harmed. Over 40,000 prisoners took educational courses. 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 learned English. 15,000 received vocational training. 8,000 enrolled in university-level programs. 5,000 eventually immigrated to America permanently. More than 12,000 maintained correspondence with Americans for over 30 years after the war ended. And perhaps the most telling statistic of all, 95% of returned prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% said captivity fundamentally improved their worldview. 61% actively explored democratic principles. And by 1945, fewer than 10% still held Nazi beliefs. These prisoners didn't just witness history, they lived it. They arrived as conquerors and left as converts, not through force, not through punishment, but through the simple, undeniable evidence of their own eyes. Defeat became enlightenment, captivity became education, and from behind barbed wire in Texas, Nebraska, and New Jersey, the seeds of a democratic Germany were planted by the most unlikely gardeners imaginable, the very men who had fought to destroy democracy. It turns out that victory's greatest weapon was never a bomb or a bullet. It was prosperity's undeniable truth, a truth so powerful that even the enemy couldn't look away. If this story gripped you, if you felt that shift from battlefield to breaking point, then you already belong here. Hit that subscribe button and join us at World War II Chronicles. Every episode we dig into the forgotten corners of the Second World War, the stories your history teacher never told you, the moments that quietly changed the world. We've got incredible episodes already waiting for you, and what's coming next is even bigger. Don't miss it. Subscribe now, ring that notification bell, and we'll see you in the next chapter.